accusations of racism and religious vilification. And I think it's an artificial issue. We have a problem of unusually unassimilable immigrant groups. We have to learn to deal with that. But to try to suppress the reality of social abrasiveness is nonsense. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, hang on, you want this back?
Yes,
Good, thanks.
Thank you very much. Get the hang of this thing one day, but it won't be tonight. Okay, that's for sure. I'd like to thank Paddy McGuinness for some very valuable insights and reminding us of what we need to know about aspects of our own history. Now, we far too easily forget that the Australian community 3 generations ago was a very different place to what it is now, and Paddy McGuinness has reminded us of our history, and living in the contemporary mould, contemporary culture, we very often forget about that. It's too easy to forget. Now, our third speaker on the multicultural issue is Professor David Flint. Professor David Flint was the chairman of the Australian Broadcasting Authority from 1997 to 2004 and chairman of the Australian Press Council from 1987 to 97, national convener of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy since 1999, and national president of the World Jurists Association from 1995. So I'd like you to welcome him in the usual way. Thanks a lot. I think this goes on your lapel and it goes in your pocket. There you go. Thanks a lot. Pick up my manuscript.
In my time. That's okay, good. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I must be much more ancient than Paddy McGuinness, because I recall, well, I recall distinctly the Chinese market gardeners, and I also recall the market gardens, and there's still traces of them out at Mascot. I think there's still one which seems to be a market garden. Ladies and gentlemen, you will not fail to notice that the panel tonight is a fine example of the diverse nature of Australian society. When my maternal grandparents came to this country in the early 20th century, they must have been considered suspicious because both of my maternal grandparents and all of the children were administered the dictation test. And you know what that was for. Fortunately, it was given to them in English, although they came from the Dutch East Indies. It was given to them in English, and they must have passed with flying colours, otherwise I wouldn't be here tonight, would I? And I remember when I was a young man at the university, when the bulletin used to come, which was then, I think, coloured, had a reddish colour, pink, yes, pink. It had nothing to do with its politics. But the bulletin used to have, just underneath the heading, Australia for the white man, Australia for the white man. And that was just before the Packers bought it. I think it was got rid of that slogan before the Packer family took it over. Or was it when they took it over? Well, we can thank Kerry and his father for that. When I was a young article clerk, my master solicitor told me that 2 of my clients, who were German, had come in while I was out on some errand. And they'd said, Mr. Flint writes us very beautiful letters, but we don't understand them. When I was at the Press Council, I remember on one occasion saying to a complainant, you needn't go into great detail about what's in the documents because the whole panel is au fait with the brief. later on towards the end, after all there'd been a discussion, he said, well, there's not much point coming here. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, well, you've all made your minds up. You said that yourself. And obviously, au fait was not the word to use. So I think with those experiences, I've become very careful about the words that I use. And we have here tonight multiculturalism and Australian identity. Well, I ask you, what is Australian identity? What is that? I recently saw a photograph of my class in primary school, and there was all these boys with blonde or light-coloured hair, and it must have been winter because they all had white skin except for one with slightly darker skin and jet black hair. So we couldn't say even then, when I was a young boy, that Australian identity was necessarily Anglo-Celtic. And there are other generalisations which I don't think we can say are part of Australian identity, although we sometimes like to say that being a larrikin, being athletic, being tall and lean, these are sometimes resented, but they certainly don't represent the whole Australian community. I think when you use the terms Australian identity, you're really saying, what is our identity as a nation? What is this? What is Australia? What is the identity? I think you will find that going back to the settlement in many ways. And if you follow Alan Atkinson, the historian, rather than Robert Hughes, another historian, you would agree with me that the colony, however awful it may be in modern terms, the colony was not a gulag. It was a colony which was, at that time, an enlightened response to the perceived problems in the UK of criminality. When Governor Phillip came to this colony, as it then was, he brought 4 gifts. He brought us the English language, which has determined very much who we are. He secondly brought the rule of law. Phillip was not a dictator. Phillip came with a charter of justice, very clear instructions about the application of the rule of law which preceded any other developments in the colony. It certainly was not an arbitrary establishment. He brought, of course, the Crown, the institution which is still with us and which is above politics. And the 4th thing he brought to this land were our Judeo-Christian values. And saying that the country is built on those values does not in any way exclude those of other religions, and it doesn't exclude those of no religion at all. It just means that the values on which our identity was made, for example, monogamy, all of this came with the settlement in 1788. And the British were not slow. I agree with Paddy. It must have been difficult for Paddy to say that. I agree with Paddy that the British were not perfect, certainly not, particularly in Ireland and other places, but they were by far so much better than any of the other colonisers, because very soon to the colonies they brought self-government, responsible self-government under the Westminster system. Last year there was an attempt to portray this as the result of a skirmish in Victoria at the Eureka Stockade. The legislation was already in London going through the British Parliament. The British, unlike the Bourbons, did learn from their past errors. They did learn from the loss of the American colonies, and they knew that in Canada and Australia, that if they didn't give what they had at home, they would have problems. So very quickly, surprisingly, we received our self-government under the Westminster system. The final step, I think, in Australian identity was our federation. And this was our own exercise. And we established our own polity. And this was an extraordinary thing. The commentators on the Constitution, Sir John Quick and Robert Garran, described the remarkable nature of that act of federation, which tells you a lot about the identity, the Australian identity. They said this, just straight after federation: never before have a group of self-governing, practically independent communities, without external pressure or foreign complications of any kind, deliberately chosen of their own free will to put aside their provincial jealousies and come together as one people from a simple intellectual and sentimental conviction of the folly of disunion and the advantages of nationhood. This was a federation actually agreed by the people, which was not the case of the preceding federations. The people did not vote in those previous federations. This was done peacefully. I remember a Chilean coming to Australia and talking about this remarkable thing. Here was a country created, federating together without any violence. Extraordinarily sophisticated act. I remember talking to a French professor who was a visiting professor at the University of Queensland, and he was saying he was astounded that in 1900 the British would agree to allow colonies to come together to federate and therefore be more stronger against the imperial power, and also give them, and this was really remarkable, also give them in section 128 of the Constitution the right to change their constitution if they so wished without reference to the imperial power. Well, I would say, and this is a long way of coming to this, what is the Australian identity? It is of the identity of a civilised, sophisticated, English-speaking, representative democracy based on received Judeo-Christian values, and one which has absorbed and Australianised the institutions which flowed from the settlement, Parliament, responsible government, the common law and the Crown. These have become Australian. So that's the first part of what we're talking about tonight. The other part is multiculturalism. What is multiculturalism? Is it a term which informs the readers immediately? Do you know immediately when you hear it, you know, oh, I know what that is, as you know, for example, what a telephone is? Do you know what multiculturalism is? Or is it a word which is too vague to have much meaning because it has so many possible meanings? Is it, as some people would call it, an Alice in Wonderland word? Because you will remember in the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, Humpty Dumpty said, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, nothing more and nothing less. Is it a Humpty Dumpty word? Well, it's appropriate, I think, at this stage to ask about Australian policies in relation to immigration. And my mother told me about the policies. There was no government assistance in those days, but they came to Australia, my grandparents, to farm. He wanted to have his own farm. So he came to Australia and bought a farm in the country. And she told me, she's no longer in this world, but she told me that when she went to school, there were Chinese children in the school, there were Aboriginal children in the school. When he didn't have the money immediately to buy a sulky to take his produce to the market, my grandfather was taken to the market by a neighbour in her sulky. The neighbour was a woman. She was an Aboriginal woman, and she took my grandfather to the market. It seemed to me, it seems from what she says, to be a remarkably multiracial society with a lot of tolerance. Well, as we've had waves of immigration, particularly the one after the Second World War, and then the later one from Asia, assimilation has been, I think, hitherto the expectation of the Australian people. But this, I don't think, meant anything more than immigrants should embrace the language, the core values, and the institutions of the nation. That is, the rule of law, representative democracy, equality, and freedom of speech. It never meant, I cannot recall it ever meaning, that migrants should abandon their religion, their cuisine, their languages, and their culture. In fact, Australians, as Paddy told us, have always learned and borrowed from these. I think immigrants have been received with great tolerance in this country. There are, of course, exceptions. Courtesy and tolerance can't be prescribed by legislation. There'll always be bad behaviour. But I think overall, it was a remarkable and smooth achievement. Just think of that wave of immigration after the Second World War without riots of any great, certainly no riots that we recall them, no enormous waves of indignation against the immigrants, no no record of great violence against the immigrants. Professor Emmanuel Todd is a widely published French historian and anthropologist, and he's written about this. He says that the ideology of multiculturalism was introduced in the 1960s by American academicians, to quote him, with a naive and perhaps devastating enthusiasm, and at times working with British and, as he says, Australian colleagues, and they exported a new ideology to the world. And he says that they brought in a form of multiculturalism, which he says came in at the very time that the cultures of the immigrant groups were beginning to disappear. He says that at this stage in the United States, very little was left of the knowledge of the cultural differences which marked the different races which had come into the United States, except from those of the cuisine. He said this was what was left in the United States when multiculturalism was introduced, and quite often that sense of the cuisine being the difference, not the languages, because as Paddy reminds us, the languages began to disappear. I don't speak my mother's maternal language. I had to learn other languages. And he says it's only the cuisine, and then often, very often, just one lone dish of that cuisine, not the whole cuisine, but just one particular dish. And what had happened in Australia is that the Australian people themselves had absorbed with great tolerance the waves of immigration that came into Australia. However, it was for the Academy, working in conjunction with their American colleagues, to seek to add an explanation to this, to seek to add something which wasn't really necessary. Multiculturalism came in as a superfluous description of what Australians had already received, that is, tolerance. There was no need to take credit in the universities from what had already been achieved by the Australian population. And if that is what multiculturalism means, which I've said it may be an Alice in Wonderland world, if it means giving special privileges to different groups in the community, then it is not something which the Australian population wants. I remember at the university, when I was Dean of Law, a proposal came to the Vice-Chancellor's Committee, which was that there should be a quota, an entry quota into the university based on a particular race. I won't go into the race at the moment. Based on a particular race. If you belong to that race, there would be different standards coming into the university. I was the only dean to oppose that. I opposed it on the grounds of principle. I argued, without persuading my colleagues, I argued that if there were a disadvantage in a particular racial group, then this should be treated at source. It should be treated in the schools. It was not for the university to lower its standards in relation to a particular racial group. It was not for the university to change the scores in relation to a particular racial group, particularly when we knew, all of us knew, that it was very easy to claim to belong to that particular racial group based on quite limited affiliation with that group. In any event, I wasn't successful in that. The point is that you can't have a situation where one group is treated differently in our society. And as an example, coming from what Paddy said, is it possible to conceive in this country that a publicly funded art gallery would, as one of the Victorian galleries did, would do something in relation to any other religious group as to the infamous photograph of the crucifix in Urine, which was presented, it was a photograph, it was presented as a work of art in a publicly funded art gallery and caused great offence to the Christian community, so much so that Archbishop Pell has